Okay, the name of the story is Sonic Pepper Sneeze. Sonic whistled to himself a bit, sometimes swinging one of his legs, sometimes drumming his fingertips on the table. His head turned to look at the clock on the dining room wall. 5 minutes past noon. He could feel his stomach trembling slightly, and he moved one of his hands over it. There was a glass of ice-cold lemonade in front of him, but he hadn't touched it, or the other glass with the same beverage on the other side of the table. Just then, to his surprise and happiness, Tails came into the dining room. In each of his hands he held a plate, each holding a couple of sandwiches that he'd made for lunch. "Here you go, Sonic," Tails said, placing one of the plates on the table in front of Sonic. The other plate, however, went on the other side of the table, where there was a waiting seat. "Thanks, Tails," Sonic said with a smile. "Oh, and thanks for inviting me over for lunch." "No problem, Sonic. It's the least I could do for one of my best friends," said Tails. He made his way over to the other side of the table, where he sat down. The two of them began to eat, each picking up one of their sandwiches, taking a bite, and chewing slowly. Sonic swallowed his bite before he spoke. "I gotta say, these are delicious." "I'm glad you like 'em," Tails said, making sure to swallow first. "I feel like something's missing, though." Sonic thought to himself for a few seconds, but then his eyes lit up as it occurred to him. "Hey, Tails, could you pass the pepper?" "Sure." Tails reached over to the pepper shaker, picked it up, and handed it to Sonic. By the way, this particular shaker had a black base and the letter P in white on the front, as well as a silver lid covered with small holes. "Thanks." Sonic took the pepper and began to shake some into his sandwich, moving his hand up and down as he did so. But just when it seemed like he'd added enough pepper, the lid of the shaker fell off, which caused all of the remaining spice to come spilling out onto his plate. "Whoops!" Sonic winced, a bit surprised. He put the shaker down on the table and looked over at his friend, not realizing at first that his nose was twitching slightly. "Sorry, Tails." Tails swallowed another bite of his sandwich before he replied. "That's all right. I have some more pepper in the kitchen anyway. And by the way..." Before he could continue speaking, however, Tails noticed something that made his eyes widen and irises shrink in shock. Now that this had happened, there was a rather large cloud of pepper floating up to Sonic's nose. There was only one thing that could lead to, and it was just about to begin. Sonic put his sandwich down, almost involuntarily, his irises dilating as his nose trembled and wiggled around. A few sneezy tears began to form in the bottoms of his eyelids. If it weren't for the amount of black spice surrounding his face, or how terribly his nose burned and tickled because of it, it almost looked like Sonic had realized just how much trouble he was in. He was going to sneeze. Ah! Sonic began to inhale, tilting his neck back as his eyelids lowered. His hand reached up to cover his mouth, but then his forefinger pressed underneath his quivering nose, which was beginning to turn red from the amount of irritation. But it was no use. The pepper continued to bother his nose, beyond description. "Ah! Oh no! Oh no!" Tails whimpered in fear. He knew it was going to happen, and he had to try and keep it from coming. Otherwise, Sonic could potentially blow the pepper everywhere, or blow himself into the wall with the force of his impending sneeze, or ruin his own lunch with his saliva. For some reason, that third possibility made Tails want to stop him from sneezing even more. "Ah! Ah!" Sonic kept his finger beneath his burning nose, his eyes equally feeling hot and bothered from the amount of pepper in the air. He didn't want to sneeze, but the tickle in his nose was growing by the second, almost exponentially. "Ah! What am I going to do?" Tails thought to himself, getting out of his seat in a panic. His head turned this way and that, trying to find something that would help keep Sonic's sneeze from escaping. He couldn't find anything he thought would work, but he had to hurry and think of something. Sonic was probably less than 1 minute away from exploding. Knowing he had no other choice, Tails reached up to plug his nose shut with his thumb and forefinger. "Ah! Ah!" Sonic couldn't hold it back any longer. His finger slipped away from his nose, and he moved his upper body backward, almost as far back as it could go. Ah! But before he could release the sneeze, someone's forefinger pressed underneath his nose, just barely keeping it from coming out. Sonic opened his eyes slightly and turned his head to the right, but he couldn't see who had stopped him. His vision was blurry due to the pepper particles that had found their way into his eyes, as well as the tears that had been filling his eyes. That being said, he could hear a familiar, if somewhat nasally voice. "Don't sneeze, Sonic!" As Sonic's vision cleared, he recognized Tails, who was holding his nose shut with his other hand so he wouldn't inhale any of the pepper. Sonic would have thanked him for stopping the sneeze at such a close moment, but his nose was still incredibly tickly and felt like it was on fire due to the amount of pepper. He wasn't sure how much longer he could take. "Tails, don't," Sonic managed to say, a hint of desperation in his breathy voice. "Can't hold it." "Are you sure, Sonic?" Tails asked in worry. "I wouldn't let that out if I were you." "I'm gonna..." Upon the second word, Sonic pushed Tails' hand away from his nose, then inhaled again as he fanned his hand in front of his opening mouth. "Ha! Ah! Mommy!" Tails whimpered in dawning comprehension, but he ran out of the way as fast as he could, then pulled his hand away from his nose, and plugged both of his ears with both of his forefingers in anticipation. With a final jerk of his upper body and a climactic inhale, Sonic exploded. Achoo! An absolutely massive sneeze echoed all throughout the house as Sonic released his sneeze, with a good amount of saliva and mucus bursting out of his mouth and nose. A painful sensation made its way through his nasal passages and throat as well, and the air he expelled blew some of the pepper out of his face. Luckily, he didn't spray his food, but that was the least of Tails' concerns now that this had happened. Almost as soon as he'd finished sneezing, Sonic's finger slammed to the underside of his nose, which was now a bright red shade and still feeling incredibly irritated. But he couldn't keep it there for more than a brief moment. The tickle in his nose was still going strong. Before he knew it, he'd removed his hand to sneeze again. 3 times, in fact. Achoo! 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 Although none of these sneezes lasted nearly as long as the first, they were still quite loud, and forceful enough to expel more spray and nasal fluid from Sonic's mouth and nose. And he still hadn't had enough relief, so the sneezing fit continued. Achoo! 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 Shoo! His eyes were streaming with tears, his nose was red as blood and dripping with mucus, and his throat and chest were hurting from the amount of air he expelled. But as Sonic kept sneezing, more and more pepper was blown away from his face and onto the floor. With that, his sneezes began to decrease in intensity, although the pain they brought remained. Achoo! 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 His sneezing fit over at last. Sonic rubbed his nose weakly with his forefinger. His eyes were quite watery, and his reddened nostrils coated with mucus. Tails cautiously removed his forefingers from his ears, and then looked over at Sonic. He was quite shocked over how massively and loudly his friend had sneezed, but now that he'd seen the miserable look on his face now that he was done, the fox had become filled to the brim with concern. He made his way over to the poor hedgehog. "Oh my goodness. Sonic, are you all right?" Sonic just sniffled, hoping it wouldn't make him need to sneeze again. Thankfully, it didn't, although a slight aching sensation ran through his sinuses. "Actually, I don't feel so good." Sonic stated, sounding a bit raspy. He coughed a bit into his fist, then groaned. Oh no, Tails whimpered a bit in worry. He had a feeling the pepper might have made Sonic feel like he was coming down with something. Tails reached both of his hands into his pockets, trying to find something his friend could blow or wipe his nose with. Luckily, he was able to find a tissue in one of his pockets, so he offered that same tissue to Sonic. Here, Sonic. Gesundheit. Sonic pulled his forefinger away from his nose, then took the tissue and rubbed his nose with it, wiping the mucus from his nostrils. He didn't feel like blowing his nose. His terrible sneezing attack had left him breathless, but his nasal passages were aching enough as they were anyway. Thanks. Sorry I sneezed so hard. I'm sorry too, Sonic, Tails said in a sympathetic voice. If I knew the pepper would leave you like this, I wouldn't have given it to you. Sonic gave a rather audible sniffle, but then lowered his tissue from his face. His nose had already begun to lose a bit of its redness, although there was still some left. You know what? It's alright. I didn't know I'd sneeze like that either. Besides, it was an accident. They happen all the time, don't they? You're right, they do, Tails replied. That being said, he couldn't help but notice that there was a layer of pepper on the floor beneath them, as well as on one side of the table where Sonic had been sitting. There was also still a small amount of pepper on Sonic's plate where his lunch had been waiting, but fortunately it didn't look like too much had gotten on his sandwiches. I'd like to clean this up, but I don't want to start sneezing too, Tails said to himself, but Sonic heard him and replied. I wouldn't recommend that, said Sonic. He balled up his used tissue, placing it in his pocket for later. I don't think I'm that hungry anymore anyway. Yeah, me neither, Tails replied in agreement. At least we can finish eating later. Oh, and Tails? Yeah? Do you have any more tissues? I don't think I'm... As Sonic tried to finish his sentence, his nose began to twitch again. His eyelids lowered and his mouth fell open. He brought his upper body backward for a moment, and then let out one more sneeze, this time into his arm. Achoo! I don't think I'm done sneezing, Sonic finished, rubbing his nose with his forefinger. The sneeze hadn't been as loud as his other ones, but it was enough to make his nose feel runny. Bless you, Sonic, said Tails. Don't worry, I'll be right back. Tails made his way out of the bathroom for a moment, then came back with a box of tissues. He pulled one out, then handed it to Sonic. Here you go. Sonic held the tissue to his nose and blew, trying to be gentle so that he wouldn't bring any more pain to his nasal passages. Luckily, it didn't hurt, and as he wiped his nose with the same tissue, he gave a smile of relief. Thanks, Tails. No problem, Sonic, Tails replied with a smile. He placed the box of tissues on the table. Why don't you go and relax a little bit? I'll see if I can't get rid of this pepper. Okay. Good luck. With that, Sonic picked up his untouched glass of lemonade and made his way into the living room, while Tails pulled out another tissue so he could begin cleaning up the amount of pepper. For the next few minutes, Sonic was sitting on the couch, wiping his nose with his tissue, and sometimes taking a sip of his lemonade. As 1 minute after another passed, he could feel the soreness in his nose, throat, and chest fading away. By the time he'd emptied his glass and placed it on the end table next to the couch, his nose wasn't red anymore. Am I glad that's over, Sonic said, rubbing his nose lightly with his forefinger. Finally, Tails came into the living room, but almost as soon as he'd arrived, he suddenly had to sneeze. And so he let out a quiet, achoo, into his arm. Sonic couldn't help but give an amused smile when he heard that. Bless you, Sonic said as Tails rubbed his nose with his forefinger, looking quite cute as he did so. Thanks. Sorry, I've sneezed quite a few times now. Tails looked a bit sheepish. Well, now you know how I felt, Sonic replied, jokingly. Yeah, but I'm just glad I got all the pepper cleaned up. Tails gave a light sniffle. What do you say we go back to our lunch? Sounds good. Sonic got off of the couch and followed Tails back into the dining room. As they resumed eating, Sonic felt another light tickle in his nose while he was enjoying his sandwich, thanks to the amount of pepper he'd put on it, most likely. It didn't bother him enough to make him feel like sneezing, though. Sometimes he brought his forefinger up to rub his nose again. Like it? Tails asked, and Sonic nodded. You bet I do. Oh, and by the way, didn't you want to tell me something after I spilled the pepper? Sonic asked. Oh yeah, I did. I can't remember what it was, though, because I got distracted by you having to sneeze. It's alright, said Sonic. He figured that Tails just wanted to remind him what would happen anyway. After a few minutes, Sonic had finished eating both of his sandwiches, although Tails wasn't done with his yet. That being said, Sonic could still feel that familiar tickle in his nose, but luckily, he could see that the box of tissues Tails had brought in was still on the table. With Tails distracted, Sonic pulled out a tissue from the box. I'll just try keeping it down. Maybe you won't know, the hedgehog thought to himself. He then lowered his eyelids, inhaling quietly. Shoot! Sonic doubled over as he released a barely audible sneeze, keeping his tissue over his nose as he did so. It sounded almost like one of Tails' sneezes. Tails raised his head, swallowing one more bite of his sandwich. He looked over at Sonic, who was now wiping his nose. Was that you, Sonic? Maybe, Sonic admitted. He lowered his tissue from his face, blushing a bit as he rubbed his nose again with his forefinger. Sorry, I was kinda hoping you wouldn't hear that. But Tails just chuckled. It's alright. Bless you, Sonic. Thanks, Sonic replied, still rubbing his nose. You know, even though pepper can make you sneeze, at least it helps to make whatever we're eating taste better. Yeah, not wrong there. The end.